Welcome to Checking Your Reserve Pay, Part 3, a beginner's guide to filing eClaims or expense claims in full. My name is Jesse Matthews. I am the Local 4094 Reserve Committee Chair. This presentation is for educational purposes only, and if there is anything in this presentation that is at odds with the collective agreement will take precedence. If you're uncertain of any of the interpretations within this presentation, you can reach out to your local union officers or ultimately to the component president who has the final say on how the collective agreement is interpreted. And with that, let's go into our beginner guide to filing an eClaim. So just very briefly revisiting the calculation of per diems, we're going to focus on meal allowances in this case and making a claim for a missing meal allowance. So these are calculated as mentioned in the previous videos using Article 7.02 in the collective agreement. Every block month there is a new PDF with all the respective meal allowances for any of our destinations, and this is uploaded to Aeronet under in-flight service, crew scheduling and planning, and meal allowance. Just circle that again here for you quickly. All the recognized meal periods we've covered before, and then the Canada and US amounts remain fixed throughout the contract with a 2% increase every year, and that's reflected in the table that we see here. This is accordingly accounted for in every one of the PDFs that's uploaded to Aeronet, and then the other destinations are updated less frequently as per 7.02.03. This is a look at what a meal allowance chart typically looks like. This is slightly changed every month. Usually it's the US line that changes in the chart, since that has to be updated every month to reflect the current exchange rate. And then there's a few destinations that are tied in with the US that also update on the monthly as needed. As mentioned before, there is a document that was first put out by Local 4092 in Toronto named the Mystery of Meals. This is supplemental to the collective agreement, and it's based on past memoranda of agreement between the union and company, and it helps to calculate your per diems. So, one more point of review. We look over ground duty credits and per diems and calculation of flight hours in our flight summaries. Ground duty credits themselves are paid at ground rate, which is 1/2 of your hourly rate, or a factor of 50. There's different ways to say the same thing, but it'll show up as a factor of 50 in your flight summary, and that just means you're paid at 1/2 of your hourly rate. As mentioned before, meal allowances are calculated using Article 7.02 in the collective agreement. And of course, as mentioned before, new PDF every month with all of the meal allowance amounts is uploaded to Aeronet. So I've included a portion of my flight summary from October 2021. I've removed anything other than one of my flight pairings just to make it really easy to check everything pertaining to one of my pairings and not overwhelm you with too many numbers on the screen. So let's find the pay mistake together. We're going to use all of the previous concepts we discussed to make sure that we are being paid correctly. So if we look under flight minutes to begin, the first flight that I have, so index item number 1, it departed on October the 2nd at 9:20 a.m. for the scheduled time and 4:35 p.m. for the scheduled arrival time. In flight minutes, that was scheduled for 255 minutes, but what actually transpired for pay minutes was 257. So that means that this particular flight went over schedule by 2 minutes, and I'm being paid 2 more minutes than I had originally been blocked for. And this lines up with the schedule or better rule that we have regarding pay. Index item number 2. This shows 6:21 p.m. that this flight departed from Toronto on the way back to Vancouver, and it arrived in Vancouver at 8:05 p.m. local time. 284 minutes were originally scheduled, but this ended up being 289 minutes that I was paid for, so this flight went over schedule by 5 minutes, and again, we're paid schedule or better. So what I want to make sure with index item number 1 and 2 is that I am paid for the number of minutes I actually flew and not just the scheduled ones. So if I look under flight duty credits for index item number 1, I can see that I'm being paid for 257 minutes and not 255, so that one is okay. And then for index item number 2, I see that I'm being paid for 289 minutes and not 284, so again, that one's okay. No issues there. Ground duty credits, I am being paid. With the 787, there is a check-in time that is earlier than 1 hour prior, and in that case, we have to be paid for that extra time. In this case, it's 15 minutes of extra time. That's been paid at a factor of 50, and that turns out to be 506. So this one's okay. I'm being paid for my ground duty. Now let's have a look at the crew cycle expenses. So at the moment, I'm being paid a dinner, but let's have a look to see what I'm entitled to. So the first flight from Vancouver to Toronto left at 9:20 a.m. If I look over at the recognized meal periods, the flight departed after 8 a.m., so I would not be entitled to the breakfast. But if I look at the next meal period, the lunch meal period, the meal period is 12:30 p.m. to 1:30 p.m., and I am very clearly flying during this time since I departed at 9:20 a.m. So I am entitled to lunch. That is the first one that I'm entitled to. And remember, we always look in the departures column to see which per diem we are entitled to first. So breakfast was not entitled since we left at 9:20 a.m., but lunch certainly was. Now, if we look under the arrivals column, that's how we figure out the last per diem we're entitled to. So we already know that we're getting paid the lunch per diem, so we don't even need to check that one. And as mentioned before, we weren't eligible for breakfast. But let's look at our checkout time. So on the Toronto to Vancouver leg back, the arrival time ended up being 8:05 p.m. If we look at the arrival period for the dinner meal, it's between 5 p.m. and 6:30 p.m. and 8:05 is past that, so we are entitled to a dinner per diem as well. The snack period is between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., and since 8:05 was the arrival time, we are not entitled to this meal per diem. So that means all in all, if I look at what we went through based on the meal periods, I should be entitled to a lunch and a dinner. And what we're showing here under crew cycle expenses is that I was paid just a dinner. So there is a lunch per diem missing. The only thing left to determine is how much I was owed for that lunch. If we look in the chart, we are past April the 1st, 2021, so I'm just going to circle this part of the chart. And the lunch per diem is $19.16. So we're going to need to claim for that amount using our eClaims tool, which I'm going to walk through with you now. So to access eClaims, you're going to go to Aeronet under In-Flight Service, Crew Scheduling and Planning, and Expense Claims. You'll need to log in one more time, even though you've already logged into Aeronet, as eClaims is a separate system that's integrated into Aeronet, but still requires a login. You would just put it all in as you would expect one more time and hit the Submit button. And this is the first screen you're going to see inside of eClaims. Fairly straightforward so far. You have only two options. There's either Submit Claim right here, or there is Check Status of Claims right here. We'll go to the Submit Claim option since we want to create a new claim today. That will just be a quick little click on Submit Claim. And then the next screen that you would see is this one. There are 5 main claim types that you can do through eClaims. I'll just briefly talk about all 5 of these options, and then we'll proceed with the one that you are most likely to use if you're filing any of your own eClaims. So let's start with pay adjustment. This one is one that you can use. This is going to be if the number of minutes you've been paid out for a particular flight or flight pairing. If this is incorrect, then you would use the pay adjustment section of eClaims to put in a claim for the amount of time that you are owed. Next is ground duty. This one is usually completed by service directors in the event that you have to perform ground duties of any sort, say due to a delay or a red alert that goes beyond a half an hour from the scheduled departure time in most cases. This is paid at ground rate, of course, but an SD would put that through on your behalf and then add your employee number, and you'll be able to check it using the check status option that we saw on the previous screen. Meals not boarded, we're not going to get too in-depth into this one today, but in this case, if you were to use this, it's going to be for 2 primary reasons. One would be if you have a special meal request as a flight attendant for something like, say, a vegetarian meal, and you're working an overseas flight where this meal would be boarded for you in the back. If it's not boarded, then you would put in a claim for meal not boarded, and after filling out the appropriate information in there, you would be credited accordingly. This is also used in the event that you give your personal crew meal to a passenger in business class, for example, to make up for a lack of options available there. You are able to specify that in the meals not boarded section and again get compensated accordingly for giving up your meal. If you don't have a special meal request and your meal is just not boarded, period, on the plane for whatever reason, you would do the meals not boarded option as well. And then also if you are deadheading on an overseas pairing and you don't have any sort of crew meal on board, then you would use this meals not boarded section as well. The only stipulation for that is the wording for this usually to successfully get a claim is that you need to have not received either a crew meal or any sort of J meal. If you receive a J class meal while you are deadheading, that's considered something that's at the standard of a crew meal, and you would not be compensated as far as any missing crew meal in that situation. That's something that we can cover as a topic for another video, but that's the gist of the meals not boarded section. Crew cycle expenses is the one that you will use the most often. This is going to be related to any missing meal per diems in particular. Um, it also can be used for any missing check-in, check-out gratuity. That's the $5.05 that are added to any pairing that you have that involves a layover for each layover stay that you have. In my experience, check-in, check-out gratuity is never missed. I guess it's possible, but I have not seen that yet. It's usually just the meal allowances that end up being missing. So in any case, crew cycle expenses is the option you'll use the most often, and that's the one we're going to use in just a moment as we proceed through this presentation. Finally, there is the passport section. In case you weren't aware, Air Canada covers the costs of getting your passport renewed once it is time. Note in this case that the amount that is covered is corresponding to a regular passport renewal. If you were to expedite your passport renewal for any reason, that comes with a higher price tag, and Air Canada would only cover the amount corresponding to a regular passport renewal rate. You would be on the hook for any difference between the regular rate and the extras added for expedition of your passport renewal. Again, a topic for another video, but that's just the gist of that passport section as well. So on that note, we'll go forward with the crew cycle expenses option, because that's going to correspond to filing an eClaim for the missing lunch in the example I provided earlier. When you click on that button, you will see this screen. The important point to note is that any claims that are related to meal allowances, crew cycle expenses, it needs to be submitted within 12 calendar months of that particular block month you are checking. If you try to do it after this, none of those claims, even if they're actually legitimate, will be paid once 12 calendar months have passed. So for this reason, it's really important to stay on top of it and to know what you are entitled to and claim it as soon as possible when you notice it's missing. You would hit the continue button after viewing this screen, and this is what you're going to see. There's quite a few pieces of information that are needed to complete your crew cycle expense eClaim. And just to make things easier for you, I'm going to bring all of the items that I would use in order to complete this form. You can find some of this information in multiple locations, but this tends to be the most straightforward to very quickly add the information. So I'll just proceed forward. And here's all the things that I use to complete everything in this form. So I've brought back the section of the flight summary that shows the meal allowance that I was paid. And we've already determined that the lunch amount is what I am missing. I've also included a screenshot of my globe, as this is a good little reminder for me when I am looking at the form as to what I am trying to claim for in the first place. And then finally, we have the meal periods over here from the collective agreement, and I'm just going to circle one more time the part of the chart that corresponds to the meal amounts that we are going to be using as far as completing this form. So let's proceed forward, and I'll talk about each item as I add it. So the very first portion of this form is pairing. And this is going to be your pairing number that starts with the letter corresponding to your base and then the 4 numbers afterwards. If there were any revisions to your pairing, then there would be a letter added after those 4 numbers as well. But in order to get this value, I find the easiest thing to do is to look at this particular part of Globe Mobile and just see what's there for the pairing number. You can also get this in the desktop version of Globe, but I find using Globe Mobile is the easiest for grabbing this particular value. For pairing date, this would correspond to the date that the pairing starts. And again, the easiest way to get that is going to be over in Globe Mobile, in my personal experience, with the date that is after the slash corresponding to the pairing number. So in this case, it's V as in Victor 7063 for the pairing number, and then October the 2nd, 2021 is the date of the pairing itself. When clicking on this calendar button, what you will see is a pop-up just like this. And the easiest way to navigate this is to understand that by default, it's going to show up on the present day as far as when you were accessing eClaims. And in order to very easily navigate to the month that you're filing the claim for, you can use the small arrows to go forward or backwards, but usually we're going backwards, of course. Claiming for the future is not a thing. So you would click on this button most often, and that would go back 1 month. And in this case, it would go back to October, and then we are claiming for October the 2nd. So after clicking on that, it would auto-populate and show up like that. So next, what we're going to need is the flight number that corresponds to the missing meal that we have. We determined before that it was lunch that was missing, and the lunch meal period happens to fall during the first flight, since it departs at 9:20 and then arrives at 4:35 p.m. Toronto time. So in this case, I'm going to put in flight 108, just because that corresponds closest to the meal period where I am missing the lunch that I'm entitled to. So 108 goes in there. Flight date does not always correspond to pairing date. As we know with multi-day pairings, there could possibly be the exact same flight number, for example, that happens to leave on a different day. This is common for, say, the prairie pairings, as I call them, between Vancouver and Calgary or Vancouver and Edmonton. This could also correspond to Rapid Airs if you're based in Toronto or Montreal, that go between, say, Toronto and Ottawa, or Toronto and Montreal, where you could be doing the same flight number, but over multiple days. So that's why there's pairing date and flight date to disambiguate the two. But in this case, this is a 1-day pairing, so it will end up being the same as the pairing date in this example. But to get the flight date, I like to use this particular section of Globe Mobile to determine what the flight date is, and then that is separate from the date that's next to the pairing number. And that way there is no chance of you making any mistake when you are putting in your eClaim. So in this case, it will be the same, but that's not always the case when you file an eClaim. So same as with pairing date, you would click on the calendar button here to bring up the pop-up and then select the applicable date. So that will be October the 2nd in this situation as well. Departure airport and arrival airport, that's fairly straightforward. In this case, because we're using flight 108, that's going to be YVR and YYZ as the respective options to put into these text boxes. Meal type is going to be which type of crew cycle expense is missing. So by clicking on the arrow right here, you will see the different options that are available. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, snack, special dinner, and check-in, check-out. In the event that you are claiming for a dinner, most of the time it's going to be the regular dinner option, but special dinner, that applies in just a handful of scenarios. We won't cover that today. But for today's example, lunch is the option that we are e-claiming for, as that's missing from the flight summary, and we've determined that I am eligible for this meal allowance. So after picking lunch, it would populate, and in that case, that's completed. Reason basically is explaining to the person reviewing this eClaim what the nature of my claim is for. And by clicking this arrow, you can see the main options that we can choose from. So we see first, the layover expense amount was incorrectly calculated. That one we're not going to use in this case. That would be, for example, if you are paid a Canadian meal allowance when you're actually entitled to a US meal allowance. So in that case, you've been paid something, it's just not enough or otherwise incorrectly calculated. The next option is layover expense amount was missing. That's the one that we'll use in this case because we haven't gotten a lunch per diem at all, and we've established that we are entitled to one. So that corresponds best with layover expense amount was missing, and that's the one we'll pick. Expense claim is for special meals production costs. I've never personally had to use that one, so we won't really talk about that one in this particular video. And then check-in, check-out gratuity missing. That would be for the $5.05 for an actual layover if that hasn't been paid to you. Again, I've never seen that happen since I've started. It's possible it could, but I don't see that as something you'll need to claim for. The first two options are the ones you'll very often use if you're doing an eClaim, and the other two I don't think you'll need to use if you're eClaiming. In this case, layover expense amount was missing. Then amount entitled. That's something that you will determine using the chart. So this is the chart here corresponding to this block month, and since it's lunch that we're going for, the amount I'm entitled to is $19.16. So that's the option that I will take, and I will fill into this text box. And then amount paid, in this case because it's entirely missing, the amount paid will be 0. So I would need to put that into this box here. Finally, additional comments just adds any clarification to the person reviewing your eClaim. In this case, I usually like to make it really easy for them by telling them what I need, even though I've covered that in most of the previous stuff here already. So for a multi-day pairing, I'll say something like lunch per diem not paid on day 1 of pairing, if it happened to be the first day of the pairing, where multiple days exist in that pairing. In this particular example, just because it's a 1-day pairing, I'll just be putting that lunch per diem hasn't been paid in that text box. So once everything is put into all of the fields, you would just click on this next button here. And this is what your next screen will look like. It goes from gray to a more white background. All of the options in here are ghosted out, and you'll see a new area added called amount claimed. This is a quick calculation where the amount entitled is the first part of it, and amount paid is the second part of it. So amount paid is subtracted from amount entitled, and that leaves you with amount claimed as far as what you are looking to have claimed. If you were to be, for example, paid a Canadian rate for a per diem, even though you're entitled to US rate, you would put the US rate into this box as far as what you're entitled, and the Canadian rate into this box, and then you would have a partial number for the amount claimed over here instead. If everything checks out and you're satisfied with what you've put into all of the options, you would hit the Submit Claim button right here. If you see a mistake in what you've put in, you would instead hit the previous button here to go back and correct. In this case, everything is in that I want to be in, so I would hit the Submit Claim option here. This is what the next screen looks like. You have a reference number that's generated for any eClaim that you make. And then there is a status associated with that crew cycle expense. The first one is always submitted, and then that changes over time. Submitted date logs the exact time that you've put in that eClaim. You also have the option of creating a printer-friendly version of your eClaim. In some cases, you or an SD might have to print out your claim and then send it through company mail. For any claims that you make as a flight attendant, this option is not really something you'll need to worry about too much, but as an SD, you might have to use this printer-friendly version, for particular eClaims. In this case, it's just an option that's nice to have, but you don't need it. So if you want to go back to file another eClaim, you would just click on Home and then start the whole process over again. If you want to jump to all the eClaims you have submitted, either presently or ones you've submitted in the past, you would just hit the Submitted button there. The Help button that's over on the top right doesn't really have anything in it, so not much of a point on clicking on that. Log Out will log you out of eClaims in particular, but not out of AeroNet. So we're going to go to Submitted just to take a look at the eClaim we've just put in. So this is what the Submitted Claims section looks like. This will contain all the claims that either you or someone else has submitted on your behalf. So 554234 is the reference number for the eClaim we just made. It was a crew cycle expense underpayment. I am the one who submitted this particular eClaim. My employee number is automatically attached to it, and the submitted time of the eClaim. You'll notice that this one is in Greenwich Mean Time, as opposed to Pacific Time as was showing on the previous screen. So this isn't going to be the exact same time, of course, as far as what you see right here, but it does correspond to the same time submitted. Processed, it just shows a dash because no one has reviewed this particular eClaim yet, and that submitted status that we saw on the previous screen is showing here again. If I see a mistake or I think I don't need this claim anymore, I'm able to delete my claim by clicking on the red X here. This is not possible if the claim has been approved or denied after being reviewed, but it is possible early on if you would like to delete your claim. We can look at other parts of this submitted claims section here. For the next claim further underneath, a service director put in a ground duty eClaim on my behalf and the rest of my crew's behalf. There are two reference numbers, likely because his first claim was returned and required more context, which he put in after, and that's why there's a second reference number there. Employee number for the service director who put in the ground duty, the date that was originally submitted, and the second claim put in with clarification has been submitted but not yet reviewed by pay. Further down, you'll see that there are other eClaims made that have either been approved or denied. So in this particular case, an SD put in a ground duty claim on behalf of me and the rest of the crew. This was back in the early part of November. It was processed by pay the same day, and it was approved. So that's something where I could click into this reference number for details, and it would break down exactly what I should be expecting on a future flight summary or pay statement. Consequently, there are also some eClaims where they do not go through. In this particular example, I made an eClaim that was tied in with my training, and it was ultimately denied just because there is going to be a manual adjustment for a group of flight attendants that will be automatically paid on a future pay statement. So this individual claim was denied since it's going to be dealt with at a systemic level as opposed to at an individual level with me. But that's something that I found out by reading the comments inside of the reference number here. So I hope this explains a little bit better as far as making an eClaim and then looking at the status of your claims after that's done.